Good morning. My name is David Shenz. I'm the Vice President for Operations at ERP Suites. I'm really excited to be joined by Sean Mead, who is our Head of Security.
Good morning, David. It's really good to be here.
Another kind of threat is business email compromise, where the threat actor gets the email address and name of a key executive. And then they try to impersonate that key executive to either get Amazon gift certificates in the simplest approach or some type of other thing. We've seen iTunes gift certificates, all kind of on the simple side. And then on the more complex side, we've also seen requests for actually change like payment information and things like that. How do you kind of also defend against business email compromise as well?
The different packages that are out there, so we'll go from automated down to the user. Mm-hmm. From the automated side, we can have software that looks at these email addresses and can even look and say, look, this is coming from, I'm just going to use something very broad, gmail.com. This is coming from an address gmail.com, and yet this URL is trying to direct them to something that does not have a word in common or a company in common whatsoever out of the context of the email. So the automated software can, if it's good enough, will wind up finding that, picking it, and doing one of two or three things. If it's so obvious that the software can recognize it, it just goes ahead and quarantines it. It may send it to the user and say, hey, look, we've got this coming in. If you want to see the original URL, I can show that to you, but I won't let you click on it. Do you want to go there? And you can go so far as to have them have to release it, to request a release from IT security, for example. So those are some of the automated ways that we protect against that. The other ways are, again, through training and through, and it can be something as simple as just monthly get-togethers of your company to wind up putting out there, look, let's remember that phishing occurs, and some companies have, I'm just going to use this as an example because I've seen it in various positions. So let's say that your company does not give out bonuses. Mm-hmm. It's just not part of the standard package. If you get an email from your boss that says, hey, I'd like you to look over this spreadsheet because it contains your bonus for this year. The threat actors don't always know. I mean, a lot of companies do bonus programs, a lot don't. Remember, sometimes they do target specific, but a lot of this is by a fishing net. Mm-hmm. Think of going out and fishing. I'm throwing the net out and I'm looking for the good fish and I'll toss the others back. The effort's the same because I've got a big net. So they're throwing that out there. That's where we have to use common sense, and before we click on that, say, wait a minute, we don't have a bonus program. So that comes down to the individual and the training as well.
I always get excited when I get a bonus.
See, there you go. That's the even if the company doesn't do that, that's one of those things.
Why don't we switch gears a little bit, Sean, and talk a little bit about authentication? I know we hit on it a little bit. We started to talk a little bit about two-factor authentication, but kind of when you look at two-factor, how do you think about it in terms of rolling it out? What are the highest priorities that you want to defend with two-factor? And how do you kind of balance that against the user training requirements there?
So as far as how important and the order of rollout, let's go with that. We'll start with how you begin this process. So the two-factor, again, is meant to shield your borders, and internal as well, but especially your borders. Let's start with the borders. Before we get someone in, well, how do people come in? Email is one. It may be through a VPN. And I'm just going to take those two as my primary examples. There may be other ways depending on the company and things of that nature, but let's go with those two. So I need to shield that email somehow. My email username and password could be, especially if I'm doing AD, Active Directory, synchronization with M365, that kind of stuff, then really my network password is out there and can be touched by someone trying to log into Live Outlook or Outlook.live.com. But if we put that two-factor on there to start with, that means we've already started protecting the email. And if someone does accidentally give out their credentials, then it still has that shield. But that's not just for there. Then the next thing we want to do is make it to where because with the VPN, it's not quite as broad, right? With email, if you're using M365, the URLs are pretty well known. Hey, if I go to this, it's going to ask me for a username and a login, whether I'm a company or an individual. So you can also isolate URLs, create your own. At Microsoft, there are lots of options, but two-factor, we do that. That kind of helps to shield that level. But that VPN, you've usually got to have, or at least know, your software has to know, you have to know the URL to get to the VPN doorway. But if that's easily discovered, and if it's probably going to have your domain.com on it, so someone goes in and they start brute forcing even, they may find that URL. That would be the next thing, because now we're talking about a doorway that goes inside of our house. And we want to make sure that you don't even get to cross that threshold. So my first steps would be to try and make sure that something that's commonly known, I shield that first. And then the next thing is not so much common, but still probably easily acquired. Those two things, depending on how you've locked down your surface attack area for your company, those may be two of the only ways that someone can try and get into your house, as it were. Now, most companies have their own websites and things of that nature. That brings in the question, okay, does my main website have a login for it that allows my users in? That comes to different security policies, different applications. But again, I think, generically speaking, we would start with something such as the email that is well known, and then protect that VPN path with two-factor.
So you prioritize kind of the well-known external, which for many companies is M365, kind of maybe the not as well understood but very high priority targets that are still public facing, like VPN, and then any other public endpoints that employees log into, or what you prioritize for two-factor first.
Exactly. And then, of course, by doing that, once we get that to where, let's assume an Active Directory, if you have a centralized login facility of some sort, whatever you may be using, again, I'm going to use Active Directory because it's just very common. If you have that and you're using that, once two-factor is attached to that, well, now the next thing I can start protecting kind of by default, if you will, is anything that I want a single sign-on with. If I can get single sign-on and attach that two-factor to my source for that single sign-on, I start kind of by default protecting a whole lot of stuff.
What about administrator, IT admins, kind of those really high-value accounts that are used to maintain other systems? How does that factor into your strategy?
So when we're talking about that, again, so layers of security, you have the outer wall, and now we want to make sure that even the rooms, if you're not supposed to be in this room or this part of the house, that there are locks even on those doors, and you've got to have the proper way to get in. So we can use password vaults. That winds up helping. Zero trust is a good thing. And if we go in with that, that helps right out of the gate. If we can make it to where passwords are never even seen by administrators, and they have to have access to their password vault. But two-factor can also be incorporated for high-value targets. We can put two-factor for any administrator account that is able to get in at, for example, a global admin level. And that's, again, I know and I realize that a lot of times security is seen by businesses or people in business as a, hey, I just want to be able to do my job, and you guys keep getting in my way and slowing me down. Well, David, as I've complained to you before, even as far as that goes, look, I'm a user as well as security, so believe me, I'm the first one to really hate it when I'm working from home and I'm ready to get onto the VPN, and suddenly I realize I left my phone in the other room and it's asking me for that two-factor. I'll be complaining more about two-factor than almost any other user. And I'll be cursing those security guys that wound up putting that in. So it's not that we want to do this, but look, there are bad guys out there. We just have to realize that. So I know that that it contains extra steps, but it does help to shield that and create rooms even within the house that are protected.
And I think it's important to call out that even though two-factor authentication is a bit of a pain to use. It's much better than the old days when you had the RSA tokens that were painful to both administrate as well as to use. I think there's also a lot more flexibility in kind of how you add the two-factor authentication. Not even, a user may not necessarily have a smartphone, but they can still get, SMS on feature phone or even down to a voice call as well to provide the second factor. Could you maybe talk about kind of how those options have gotten a lot better?
Yeah, and I think you've hit it very well to even begin. In the past, and maybe a couple, I may have heard about this. Of course, I wouldn't be old enough to experience it. But the RSA tokens, now I've got this device that I have to carry around. Nothing against RSA, by the way. Great company, great encryption. And I'm not saying that there are not cases for tokens. There are good cases for high encryption and very high value targets. But let's go to the common user. The common user, when we're talking about the RSA tokens, we're talking about something that is not used for any other purpose. And it's this extra thing I've got to try and put in my keychain or somewhere else, and they get lost a lot. They used to get lost all the time. And then we got to where we could do texting. Well, that's not bad, but when texting first came out, it was still, you didn't have your phone with you all the time and things of that nature. But now, cell phones are, like you said, there may not be a smartphone, but let's assume that most people do have one. Even my mother has a smartphone. So when we look at that, we're looking for that broad base again. But the really cool thing is most of the two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication solutions do allow you to choose. And you'll see this a lot with banks. I think most people may have, if they've done any online banking, most banks have gotten down to where they will at least give you SMS, but they like giving you the voice and the email. So having those different ways to do things just makes it more convenient and makes it easier. And I think the difference in all of this is fascinating as far as you have the ability to choose that push option. So I have an application. We use Duo. If you have Duo as your two-factor authentication method, it can do a push, and here we see that now. It'll do that. But we can also choose, as you stated, a text or, and in some cases, an email or a phone call even. The options, it just makes it very much easier to use than it used to be with that one token that you didn't use for anything else.
And I am very absent-minded, as you know, and I lose my car keys on a regular basis. So not having a token that I will lose is great for me.